The chapter opens with the question, what is an animal? Well, there is a list of features that most animals share. Animals are hugely diverse, as you can see on your screen with a barn owl versus a scorpion, yet they all have some features in common. For example, all animals have multicellular bodies, they have eukaryotic cells that lack cell walls, they are heterotrophic by ingestion, they have a blastula stage of development, which I'm going to discuss more later on, and finally, they have cells that bind to an extracellular matrix. The first animals arose from aquatic protists about 570 million years ago. Many animal phyla originated during what biologists call the Cambrian explosion, when the conditions were right in that our oceans suddenly had lots and lots of life, as we can see in the fossil record. Here's our first question. What combination of characteristics do all animals share? Your first choice is multicellular, eukaryotic, and heterotrophic. Your next choice is unicellular, eukaryotic, and heterotrophic. Your third choice is multicellular, prokaryotic, and autotrophic. Your fourth choice is multicellular, eukaryotic, and autotrophic. And your final choice is unicellular, prokaryotic, and autotrophic. So please pause the lecture if you don't want to hear the answer yet. The only choice is the first one. All animals are multicellular, eukaryotic, and heterotrophic. Here's another challenge question. Here's an organism called the sea anemone, which is very common in California tide pool systems. Would we consider this green organism to be a plant or an animal? Your choices are it's a plant because it can do photosynthesis. Your next choice is it's an animal because it has a mouth and a stomach. And your final choice is it's a symbiotic relationship between an algae and an animal. How could we answer this? Is it based on evidence or definitions? Please pause the lecture if you don't want to see the answer yet. And the answer is an anemone is a symbiotic relationship between an algae and an animal. And remember that a symbiosis refers to two different species living in direct contact with each other for their entire life. The anemone is considered an animal, and we're going to learn all the features that this anemone possesses as we go on in these lecture slides. Before we begin, we're going to talk a little bit about how biologists classify animals on the tree of life. Animals are classified into 9 major phyla, and we're going to look at these phyla a little bit in this lecture. The first branching point that helps us distinguish the phyla is true tissues versus no true tissues. In sponges, which are some of the most primitive animals, they do not have cells that interact to provide specific functions, and so therefore sponges do not have true tissues. The second branching point distinguishes the radial symmetry from the bilateral symmetry in our animals. An organism has radial symmetry if any plane passing through the body from the mouth to the opposite end creates mirror images of that organism. An organism has bilateral symmetry if only one plane can divide the animal into mirror images. Bilateral symmetry is unique to evolution because it ultimately led to cephalization, which is the fancy word for developing a central nervous system with a brain in the organism. Here's our next question. How many of these creatures have bilateral symmetry? We have an elephant, a sea star, a crayfish, a jellyfish, and a sponge. And your answers are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of these animals. Pause the lecture if you don't want to hear the answer yet. It's 2. The only organisms that have bilateral symmetry are elephants and the crayfish. Now, in your textbook, it also talks a little bit about the sea stars, which you might call a starfish. As larvae, they have bilateral symmetry, but as adults, they have radial symmetry. The same branching point also distinguishes animals with 2 embryonic germ layers from animals with 3. And these embryonic germ layers are these layers of tissue that can differentiate into all of the complex cells that organisms need in order to become what they are. In all phyla except for sponges, the embryonic ball of cells, called a blastula, folds in on itself, forming the gastrula. And so in the figure in our book, it shows us this progression from a single cell to a ball of cells. And then that ball of cells folds in on itself. The ball of cells with no fold is called the blastula, and the ball of cells that folds in on itself is called the gastrula. In some animals, the gastrula only develops 2 tissue layers, and those layers are called the endoderm and the ectoderm. In other types of animals, a 3rd tissue layer develops, and we refer to that as the mesoderm. Embryonic development also determines this exact same branching point on the animal tree of life. If the first indentation of the gastrula develops into the mouth of the organism, then biologists classify that animal as a protostome. If that first opening develops into the animal's anus, then the organism is considered a deuterostome. Body cavity, organization of the digestive tract, and segmentation are some other important characteristics that help us characterize the animals. A bilaterally symmetrical animal may have a coelom, a pseudocoelom, or no coelom. And you can hear I'm pronouncing this word kind of funny. It's spelled very differently than it is pronounced. A coelom is a body cavity surrounded on all sides by mesoderm. Organisms with a coelom are the most advanced types of animals. A pseudocoelom is surrounded on only one side by mesoderm and the other side by endoderm. So these are more primitive types of animals. And the most primitive animals lack a coelom altogether. They have very limited movement because they don't have a body cavity. Animals have an incomplete digestive tract if the mouth functions as both a way to take in food and a way to release your waste. For example, the sea anemone that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture is an example of an animal with an incomplete digestive tract. More advanced animals have a complete digestive tract, in which food goes in one end, which is the mouth, and then it passes out as waste from the anus. Some animals have segmented bodies, like this millipede and centipede, and these segments were very important for evolution over millions of years. Segmented bodies are more flexible and have more potential for being specialized over evolutionary time. Natural selection, the mechanism of evolution, may act upon these segments, giving us a huge diversity of very unique body parts. Different combinations of these qualities are what characterize each of the animal phyla. For the purposes of this class, we're not going to have to memorize all of the different phyla, except for one. Before we get started with the next part of the lecture, let's look at this challenge question. Which type of animal does not go through this sequence in its early development? And the sequence that we see is we go from single cell to a blastula. Your choices are sea star, shark, snail, sponge, or flatworm. Please pause the lecture if you don't want to hear the answer. The answer is sponge, because remember, sponges don't have true tissues. Sponges are just loose groups of cells that function as an animal. When you're studying for the exam, make certain you can describe all the features that were used to build our animal phylogenetic tree. The last part of this lecture is towards the end of the chapter, in which we're going to learn about the chordates. Chordates includes us, humans, and many other types of mammals. Chordates also includes some invertebrate types of animals as well, animals without a backbone that still share characteristics with more advanced animals with a backbone. Each chordate has these unique features at some point during its life. The first feature is a notochord. In many chordates, the notochord develops into a backbone. In most but not all. And animals with a backbone are what we consider to be the vertebrates. A second feature is a dorsal hollow nerve cord. And in many chordates, this will develop into a spinal cord. A third feature is called pharyngeal pouches or slits. These are what we can think of as gills. And even humans, when they're in the womb, initially have gills on the sides of their neck to help them breathe inside their mother's womb. And then 4, a postanal tail. And again, even humans, as embryos, have tails. But of course, when we're born, most of us don't have a tail anymore. Jumping ahead a little bit further, fossils and DNA tell the human evolution story. Biologists know that humans are in a group of placental mammals called primates. Monkeys and apes are also primates. We have a placenta in females that nourishes the growing baby. Monkeys and apes also have a placenta. Other features we share with our chimp and ape ancestors includes opposable thumbs, long arms, and upright locomotion. All of these are notable adaptations in one or more primate groups, including humans. Similarities in bone structure reveal evolutionary relatedness as well between both chimpanzees and humans. In addition, molecular data of both DNA and proteins also supports this anatomical data. Finally, mitochondrial DNA suggests that early humans inhabited Africa and later migrated to other continents. So how is it that we know that all modern humans ultimately came from Africa? Well, scientists sequenced the mitochondrial DNA of groups of people all over the planet that are currently alive today. When you're studying for the exam, make certain you can describe how skeletal anatomy and DNA tells us a lot about the evolution of primates, including humans. The last part of our lecture is all about transitional species. Transitional species help biologists solve evolutionary puzzles. For example, this is a news item not from our textbook, but from a journal, in which they recently identified a fossil of a giant bat that walked on all fours 16 million years ago. Of course, modern-day bats fly, but this shows a species that hadn't quite evolved wings, but still was on the brink of evolving these highly adapted appendages. The last part of our chapter is investigating life. Let's discover the quote-unquote fishapod. The fishapod is a piece of the puzzle that helps us understand the transition from fish to amphibian. Of course, fish live in the water, and amphibians can survive on land. Tiktaalik is the funny name of this fishapod that marks the transition between fish and a tetrapod, such as a salamander, that lives life on land. If we look at the word tetrapod, tetra means four and pod means feet. So these are organisms that support their weight on four limbs. Tiktaalik has very well preserved fossils found in some parts of the world. And these fossils reveal that Tiktaalik had bony limbs fringed with fins. The wrist bones were strong enough to support short excursions onto land. And yet it still had these fins at the tips of its strong feet because it still could paddle around in the water as well. These fossils support predictions about the early evolution of tetrapods, which are those organisms with four legs. As you're studying for our exam, make certain you can describe how might the ability to crawl on land for short periods of time have enhanced the evolutionary fitness of this fishapod called Tiktaalik.